This is a kind of fun topic for me. It strikes home a lot. About 5 years ago, I remember working pretty late one night. I was in my office, my part of the building. Pretty much all the lights were out. It was dark outside, and the glow of the monitors was shining on my face, and I was working fervently to wrap up a release of software for one of our customer applications. I've been spending all day long getting ready for this, and they had asked a couple of days before to, kind of we've liked what we've seen so far. Can we go ahead and start releasing this? And something we did about once a month at the time. And of course, so being responsible for the project, it's my responsibility then to make sure we can do the release. Things as far as the code were pretty good because we had version control. I think we were using SVN at the time, so we were in a pretty good state, but I still kind of like to look through the history and just see what had changed since the last release, kind of understand again in my mind if we wanted all of those changes going out, if there wasn't anything complete, just kind of get a recap in my mind of what we were going to be pushing out into production and make sure that nothing stood out as like, oh no, we forgot about this type thing. So the code was pretty good, I just kind of meticulously went through it. It's the database that was the problem. So of course, I get done with my code review and I move over to the database side of things, and we're using a shared database. And these still exist today. It's pretty typical. Everybody's working off of the same database to do their development changes, making your little schema modifications, breaking everybody else's code in the process until they can get the update. And that's probably not the least painful part. Or the most painful part. The most painful part is me sitting there that night working late, taking a copy of production, actually probably pointing at production, and diffing it with the development database to try and figure out what had changed over the last month, and getting that ready to go with the code. And I'm a meticulous person. I don't like things to go out without me knowing maybe 2 or 3 times that they should be going out. And so every little change, once I pulled that diff up, I would go through it and I would kind of try and correlate it to the code and understand, is this something that we need? Does it go some of that code we need to throw away maybe? Have we thought through this? Are we going to cause any problems? And try and recreate basically the history of the migrations we had made to our database along the way so I could prepare a migration script as well. And most of the time that wasn't a painful process. To be honest, because we had a shared database, we didn't make a lot of changes if we didn't have to our database. So we kind of like, that's kind of how you approach that. You have a shared database, you end up then reluctant to evolve anything in your database at all. So many reasons it was kind of perilous, but the worst of which is just trying to go through and duplicating all that effort that knowing 2 weeks or a month ago, me or someone else was working on this, and we knew at the time whether or not we needed it. We just didn't have the discipline or a process to help us establish what was necessary going forward and throw away the rest, basically. And so there's a lot of extra effort there at the end to integrate the work into something that we can then release. And it was that night, I can't say specifically what night, I kind of looked through the history of that project to kind of find out when. It was June sometime, 2009 for me, that I said, something has to change, okay? And that's the question I have, and I think if you're going to walk away with anything tonight, ask yourself, what has to change in my development process? What has to change to improve how I develop and deliver my software? Or our team develops and delivers our software. Because at the end of the day, that's what continuous integration is to me. It's improving how we deliver our software from the start of a feature all the way through to the actual delivery of that feature. And we get a lot of things thrown at us as developers, and I think that's why I was where I was at that point, is I was working 50, 60-hour weeks to produce the code that we were going to then release, and working with a customer to get them to understand the changes we were making, play with it, and getting their feedback and adopting all of that. And in the process, I never had the time to invest in how can this change so it's not so painful. But at some point, we have to make that commitment. We have to stop and say, you know what, something has to change so that I don't have to waste this time going forward, and I can invest that time instead in maybe having a life, or maybe in developing more features for my customers and delivering more value to them. So that's kind of what's important to me about continuous integration. I think I need to jump a slide here. So yeah, people will, I think, sometimes throw this at us as a best practice. And that can be pretty confusing because the body of patterns in continuous integration is as various as the code bases that exist in this world. what you end up is going to be very specific. What you end up with is going to be very specific to your application and isn't always going to be reusable. And where you start versus where you'll be in a month, 3 months, a year, 2 years, and 5 years down the line can be rather daunting to look ahead and think, I've got to get all this done overnight or I'm not going to get any value out of it. And that's simply not true. So I hate to come at it from the best practice perspective because it almost assumes you already know why all this stuff is good to use in the first place. And practices are great to kind of have in your pocket as a shortcut, but they are shortcuts that skips around understanding why these things are important. So I prefer to come at CI from a perspective of, what can this do for me? Why would I use this? How is this going to improve things? And I'm just kind of curious, how many people feel like they have a rather robust continuous integration practice in the projects that they develop? Now, nothing against anybody. I understand there's like a bazillion factors as to why this doesn't happen. I think the number one of which is we're bang away 60 hours a week making features and don't ever spend time on the process itself because that could never possibly pay any value back to us right now anyways. Okay, so I don't come at it as a best practice. Strive to understand why things are awesome, and then as you get comfortable with them, you'll know when they shouldn't apply and when they should apply, and it'll become kind of natural to know when you should use these techniques, and you don't have to worry about, well, it's a best practice to have an automated functional test suite in this application that only gets deployed once a year, for example. So start with your gut, like that night. Chances are, if it's painful, you know it, and your teammates know it. And it's maybe just something that hasn't been discussed. So start with your gut because it's going to give you the objectives that you can go after and apply continuous integration patterns to try and fix. Once you kind of have an idea that something's wrong, you want to start looking for things that you can improve, right? So we can apply these practices and, like I said, just blindly put them in our projects and then just kind of accept that they're there. Or we can say, hey, you know what, we have some problems. And let's talk about those problems. And maybe one of those problems is we're not delivering enough value to our customers. I'm wasting 3 days getting ready for a release when I could have spent that 3 days building the next set of features for them. Maybe that problem is we have a lot of mistakes coming up. What can we do to reduce the number of mistakes? Maybe we don't have confidence in what we're developing and we would like other people to be giving us feedback, but we don't have a mechanism to do that. Problems. I mean, there's problems we want to solve with our delivery process. Maybe we just don't have tests, and maybe we don't feel confident because of that. And so there's problems that we can tackle. It can make our job easier to the point where you don't have to be there at 9 o'clock at night. Matter of fact, I think one of the cool measures to use is look at the amount of overtime people put in as you begin to apply continuous integration patterns. And unless you have a boss that expects you to then make up that time elsewhere, you should probably actually see a graph of overtime drop off to almost nothing as you're over years of applying these types of practices. There's going to be no reason to come in late at night, except maybe to push a button to say go to a process to deliver something. And it can make us happier, I think. If we're not sitting behind that computer monitor at 9 o'clock at night, diffing production and development databases, and pulling our hair out trying to figure out what changed, we can have a life, and we can be excited about building new features because we're going to have this process to help us deliver them. Okay, so we can identify some objectives, and that's a good way to come about this because it helps us understand why we should be doing this. It also helps us understand why we shouldn't maybe use some of these patterns in certain situations. The next step then, before we tackle a problem and say, yeah, I got this problem, I am just going to do whatever it takes to fix it. We want to probably say, okay, we've got a problem. How can we know how can we quantify what that problem is? So that when we start to solve it, we can know if we're solving it. And that's where I think metrics come into play. I think it's a big important thing to kind of understand if I'm putting a continuous integration pattern into effect. Let's measure something before and let's measure something after. And that's not always easy. That's highly subjective as well. But if you start looking at what you went in with and what you came out with, you might actually be able to decide, you know, this wasn't worth it. Or this is really awesome. Look at what we did. And then you can share that with other people and help them understand why that's important. Some very high-level ones I like to refer to as kind of like results. They're what we're ultimately oriented towards. They're things like, can we deliver faster so we can grow our customer base, which is what the business cares about. Right underneath of that, if we're going to grow our customer base by delivering faster, we need to reduce our time to market. And time to market, that's getting a little closer to reality here, right? That's a part of delivering. Maybe we've got just tons of defects coming from customers and we would like to get a handle on this and reduce these. We'd like to know about them before they get into the hands of customers. And we would like to reduce the time it takes to fix them. Maybe we're just not happy with how often we release things. So stepping down a notch. If we can crank our delivery frequency up, we're going to decrease our time to market because the duration of doing a deployment is going to drop as well. So these are all kind of really high level ones. These are the difficult ones to probably measure. Though down towards the bottom, you can probably start pegging some times on these things. Maybe we got a lot of rollbacks. Maybe we're deploying things and we're finding out there's big problems and having to pull back, and the time wasted doing that. And the one I like then, instead of the custom, maybe we can start measuring how many defects do we catch before customers find out about it. But right below the results-oriented metrics are a better set that we're going to probably relate to tonight as I walk through this. And I kind of like to think of these as supporting predictive indicators. They're the things that, if we know these are improving, we're making progress towards those more important objectives. If we can't maybe measure our customer growth's correlation to adding an automated build step, we can perhaps know things like, if we increase the frequency of our commits, we probably can reduce what's going into a change set and probably deliver a little faster. Or a bunch of other things we'll see later on when we correlate this. If we decrease the duration of integration, building, and testing our code, and maybe even delivering our code, all those durations that make up a delivery process, if we decrease those, we're going to decrease our overall duration, which is going to decrease our time to market. So it's like these can kind of support those other, and these are much easier to measure. Failures, we're going to see a lot of that tonight. Merge failures, if we can decrease those, if we can decrease build failures, if we can decrease test failures, and if we can find out about these sooner rather than later, we'll invest less time in actually fixing these because we'll have the context in our mind to actually fix them. If we knew about it the day it happened, we'll be able to fix it within a few minutes. If we find out 2 or 3 weeks later, we got to try and recreate where we were at. That's a huge waste of time. And just the time to fix those. And another easy one is just the number of tests. This is a fuzzy indicator, but we know probably if we're increasing our tests, we're probably building a better solution with more quality at the end of the day. And then the ones I really like, which, they're on the lowest on the totem pole because they just deal with the people that are inputs to the process. But if the inputs to the process are happy, that's a really, really good thing. And that's where further change happens then. Things like feelings. How do people feel about the project? Do we have that gut reaction? Are we upset because we have to work overtime? How are people communicating? As we start to integrate more frequently, we're going to see that the opportunity to communicate with other people increases. And if we aren't communicating, we're going to find out about it a lot sooner. And then we're going to get a chance to communicate then. So measuring interactions in terms of how often maybe do 2 people find out they're working on the same area of code at the same time and it's time to touch base and I'll put mine aside, you go ahead and do yours, and then I'll come back to that tomorrow or something like that. And yeah, less late nights. So get some metrics. Use those to determine if you're making progress. Find something you can measure before. It's not all of those things can you measure before, but find something you can measure before that's going to solidify the direction you're going in, and then tackle it. And that's what we're going to kind of go over tonight, are some typical patterns you can use to tackle some typical problems or objectives. Do it as a team. Figure out what your top priority is, your top objective. Do a little bit of an analysis of if we fix this, if our measure, maybe take your metric, look at where it's at now. I think I might have missed that one. Take your metrics, look at where it's at now, and then decide where you would like to be and say, if we got there with that metric, if our frequency went from releasing every 3 months to every 1 month, what would that mean to us as a business? Look at the value of that to justify investing in these types of things. Implement it, tackle it, and then when you're done, measure it and see where you got. And that's okay if you didn't quite nail the target you wanted. You can at least see what you got out of it. And maybe that means coming then back to the same objective. Maybe it means moving on to the next objective. And incrementally make that commitment to improve this process. So I like to throw that out there because I think that's a good way to organize approaching continuous integration without just blindly throwing a bunch of patterns and processes together and then getting very frustrated because some of these patterns and practices, you can go overboard and it's as easy to waste time with unnecessary parts of a continuous integration process as it is to not implement a continuous integration process at all. So you can get frustrated if you don't know what you're doing and give up. And if people aren't seeing progress, quantifiable hopefully, it's very justifiable. And some people that don't like what's going on or aren't on board with it or aren't being supported by it are possibly going to derail efforts then to continue going forward. Tonight I'm going to kind of go through some incremental objectives that I think are pretty typical for you, the problems that are pretty typical for all of us to face, and some of the solutions you can basically use to tackle those. I'm also, if we have time, we'll talk about some additional ones. There's like a bazillion we could talk about. You can bring them up too if you have something you'd like to discuss. Interrupt me at any time. For each of these objectives, I've kind of tried to structure this. Here's the problem. Here are some, here's why it matters. Here's some measures that could help you determine if you've made progress towards solving it, and then a proposed solution. Not every solution is going to work in every situation, but it's a proposed. And then a few of them will be able to do some demos, time permitting as well. How much time do I have, by the way?
About 8:30 or so.
Oh, absolutely. Yay, we're going to have a lot of fun. Or everybody's going to be asleep really soon. Okay, so I'm going to be demonstrating in TeamCity. How many people have used TeamCity? Okay, people use it right now at work. All right, anybody use anything like TeamCity, Jenkins, TFS, anything like that? Okay, all right, so I mean, there's a wide variety of tools out there. I like TeamCity, I've worked with it, it's a fantastic tool. It is a tool though. At the end of the day, you can use other things. You have to kind of decide what works for you. I like it because it's a great way to automate the things we're going to talk about tonight. So it's a point of automation. It has fantastic support for triggering automation anyway from Sunday when things happen to your code base or times of day or whatever it might be that you decide you want this automation to happen. It's very compositional in terms of composing what you want to happen. We'll see tonight how we can kind of compose things in TeamCity, and then we'll step back and show how we can plug in other tools for composition as well with Rake. And it's got amazing tracking of history of every aspect of a build. All the statistics can be put into charts, so you can actually some of the measures it will produce for you. So some of these measures that I was talking about, the more predictive supporting measures, you get out of the box by using TeamCity. So you don't have to do anything but start using TeamCity and baseline your metrics and then look at the improvement you're making by adopting these practices. And also, it has an amazing history of your build artifacts, which can be extremely valuable, as we'll see in a little bit. And like I said, interrupt me anytime, any questions, something that maybe would apply to your situation. Let me know. I'd love to. This is all hypothetical, so I can just rant up here.
I have one more question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So do you have experience with some of the alternatives that you mentioned?
My alternative experience is, outside of using TeamCity kind of put things together myself, is to either A, just use command line tooling and not have the automation, or B, it's like using something like Heroku, more of a platform as a service, to App Harbor, something like that, an Azure deployment, where you're basically committing code to a repo and then it's kicking off a lot of this. It's kind of convention-based, if you will. You set up a config file and it just picks it up and goes from there. So it's a more platform as a service.
I was just asking you if you've had experience, say, with TFS.
Yeah, no, not TFS and not, I haven't done anything with Jenkins either. So.
Okay.
But these processes, I guess, to be honest, if anybody has a question about cruise control, I did use that a long time ago, but I feel like cruise control's kind of died off. It is an open source alternative, though. It's a lot older. It's from ThoughtWorks. That was kind of the thing before TeamCity. TeamCity is just like cruise control. You're in XML to configure things most of the time. TeamCity provides a fantastic interface over basically their XML configuration. So that's why I like it. A little bit about the measures. Like I said, there's some very results-oriented measures. Things like time to market, number of defects that customers are finding, and customer growth. Those are applicable to all of these, but they're difficult to maybe measure specifically. So I just want to point out those are applicable to all. I'm not going to like put them on every slide. I'm going to mostly look at predictive ones when we're going through these. And a few just overarching benefits you're going to see and overarching themes you're going to see. It's about getting us to a working state wherever we're at in the process and knowing that things are not failing at that point. You're going to see a lot about increasing feedback, and you're also going to see a lot about basically reducing mistakes. Yeah. Okay, so we kind of start out with that gut reaction like I was talking to, and listen to it, and take the time to do something about it and talk to people. The things you can measure, at least the first one, is if people can sit down and talk about this, and my proposed solution is to commit to this as a team. If we can sit down and just talk about it, people are going to start feeling better about it most likely. And that's something you can actually ask people about. As you're making the commitment to begin down this journey, or if you're already on this journey and you're making the commitment to take the next step, you should actually almost immediately start to see people getting excited about it. If not, perhaps, and under kind of the team commitment, perhaps you're not relating it to how it's going to benefit people on the team. Because I think that's a big component of it. There has to be some self-interest for everybody here. This can't just be like a top-down initiative. It has to be very bottom-up for people to actually adopt and support this. Because if you try and do this process alone, you're just going to be working against everybody else because nobody's going to be following the practices and processes that make it efficient. So you're going to have to be doing all the work they should have been doing. So you really need that team commitment. And to get that, you really need to show everybody how it's a benefit to them, basically. And as a team, perhaps that's what you have to understand. There might not just be one person like showing everybody. And I think if you sit down and talk about what the major pain points are, you're going to get everybody on board with it and excited about it. Because we all know what those problems are. And if we're not excited about it, then maybe we're just not excited about our job. But, that's another whole problem. And also, like, as you move down the line here, maybe these are more overarching, is there should be less late nights. There should be less overtime. Unless you have somebody that's like, okay, well, you saved all that time, now I expect you to use it elsewhere. Which hopefully is not the case. Which may not be the reason why you had problems with overtime in the first place then. You should start to see that decrease if it's just because you're staying up late to do that release, or you're staying up late to get ready for that release, or, so you can get other stuff done during the day. Okay, so after everybody can kind of commit to it, I guess the first place a lot of people are going to find themselves is, and I think, how many people in here use version control for their software, for their code? Okay. Has anybody come upon a project as of recent that didn't use version control? Wow, you guys are lucky. Because I had a friend who asked me to help him, and the first thing I noticed was there's no version control, and I'm like, oh, but it happens, and it's okay. I mean, that's reality. There are still plenty of people that are at that point. Well, not only if you don't have version control and you have like a shared code base, maybe you have burdensome version control too. I wouldn't be surprised that a lot of people aren't in this position. I'm not going to like pick and choose. I am going to make a recommendation here that's going to make that kind of more obvious, but the fact of the matter is you can have version control and you can have effective version control. And having effective version control is going to do more things for you. Some of the things you can measure as far as how effective your version control is, are you losing features? Because if you don't have version control, or you have burdensome version control, especially when it comes to maybe resolving merge issues, it's likely that people are going to be annoyed with the process and start clicking buttons, or if it's just copy-paste deploys, you're going to lose stuff at times. People aren't going to care as much if it's a big hassle. I've dealt with version control systems in the past where it was 30 minutes of work to go from an offline state to an online state and reconcile all the differences. And for me, that was a meticulous nightmare. I know for a lot of people it would be select all and hit just do it. And that's not a good thing. So lost features happen. Version control, going from no version control to version control, or even burdensome version control to non-burdensome, your durations of releasing software should decrease. So that's something that should be directly measured. Especially if you have none. I mean, think about the process there. Unless you're not meticulous, you're going to like diff the code like I was diffing the database to see what needs to actually go out, and that's just wasted time. And then, of course, burdensome version control or none, you're going to have issues looking back in history. If you can't look back in history to see what changed and for what reasons, you're going to waste a lot of time doing that investigative research. So maybe you can't quantify that, but it's something you could recognize as something you can move the indicator on as you're applying a better version control practice. My recommendation, if you want to improve things, is to move to a distributed form of version control, especially if you have nothing to begin with. It makes the history is typically all local versus remote. You can work offline really easily. You can work in small steps. I kind of like to think of it like a checklist, where you can kind of check off each little thing without interrupting anybody else's checkoffs, because you don't have to share those checking your code in with everybody else when you want to. You can just do it anytime you want. You can roll back easily. And the best one is with distributed, like the light bulb came on for me when I kind of wanted to do some refactorings, or I kind of wanted to play with a new idea. But with SVN, like, oh God, like I had like changes that I needed to keep, but I wasn't ready to share, but I kind of wanted to explore a little. And all of a sudden, like, I'm now trying to explore while not messing up the code I know is complete. But I can't push it yet because I'm not ready for that for whatever reason. With distributed version control, it's cheap to explore. I can commit where I'm at, I can start my exploration, and in 15 or 30 or 45 minutes, I may go, oh my gosh, where am I going? This is wrong, I don't have time for this today. And throw it all away, stash it, whatever, get it out of there, and go back to at least knowing what I had done is done, and then try another path. So cheap exploration. Once you've adopted a non-burdensome version control, perhaps we should say, you'll notice then that you're probably going to run into a lot of merge conflicts. And that's because if people are coming from a background where you don't integrate very frequently, maybe I should ask how many people integrate, like, will push their code remotely every single day multiple times? Okay. And how many people maybe once a day, at least? And how many people like deal with people where it's like once a week? I don't know. So I mean, the reality is, like, especially if you move from none or really burdensome version control, you're going to see people working on changes over the span of several days, maybe even a week or longer, and then they're going to be sharing it with everybody else. And that just, it's basically like having a lot of separate copies, and a lot of work's been done by a lot of different people in that time frame. Then obviously when we come to bring it back together, we're going to have more problems. So yeah, infrequent integration is one of the next things that will happen. Especially if you have distributed version control, where you can work quite a bit on your own, but if you aren't in the habit of then sharing that with anybody, perhaps you can still run into a lot of integration issues. Some things you can measure as far as the problems related to frequent merge conflicts is the number of merge failures. How much time do people spend merging code? Are people happy about, how many times do you have people hear people swearing that somebody else pushed their code before they did? So how happy are people about this? How often are you integrating? You now have a version control system, especially in a distributed one. You can query that thing and find out how many commits are happening per day. You can even find out at least where right now if like somebody hasn't been pushing for a period of time. So you can start to get some of that information about how often people are integrating. Because, yeah, go ahead.
So doing things agile versus traditional, does that have a bearing on?
I don't really think so. I think no matter how you, I guess if you're in the traditional world of like people work on islands for weeks or months at a time, these are going to manifest is what's going to happen. And so then I think even on a traditional project, once you get to the implementation phase, if that's truly isolated from your planning, then you'll notice that these techniques are still fantastic because they'll help you implement things effectively as well. So, I mean, these are implementation techniques at the end of the day.